So after the Snowden leaks, you all read about the NSA's mass collection of Americans' telephone data. That's not why I'm here today. What I'm here to talk about today is much bigger and less well understood. Every time you send an email, that email, say to your neighbor across the street, that email doesn't just exist on your computer and your neighbor's computer. It's also stored on a global network of servers. So if you send a Gmail, it winds up in Brazil, in Japan, in Germany, in the UK, and Canada. The second your data leaves the borders of the United States, it is no longer protected by US law. The NSA treats your data as a foreigner's data, and it collects it, it stores it in databases for 5 years, it searches it, it shares it with the FBI so Americans can be prosecuted. It shares it even with foreign governments, so the UK, Canada, Israel. This is happening because the rules that created to guide the NSA were created before the internet, and so there was rules domestic for how it needed to operate inside our borders, and there was a different set of rules for how it has to operate outside of our borders. And those rules were written before Americans' data was routinely stored all over the world, and it made sense at that time. But as we'll see, that's not necessarily holding up today. This is also not well known. So even a year after the Snowden leaks, there had not been a single major news story exploring how this NSA capacity outside of our borders affects Americans' rights. This came to me very personally as a challenge earlier this year in January 16th. I was at my office in the State Department working late. My boss calls me, you gotta come down. I get there, he's just received a copy of the speech that the president is going to give tomorrow, January 17th. The speech is the outcome of 7 months of review of the NSA's practices and U.S. intelligence activities. And a little background here, my job was to work on internet freedom, to promote a free and open internet with governments and international organizations around the world. I had a top secret clearance to receive sensitive compartmented information. And as I'm reading this speech, I'm realizing that the speech, the same way as all of the news coverage, is missing the most important thing, which is how Americans' data is collected and treated under this other executive order called 12333. So now's when I need to make a legal distinction. People's eyes usually glaze over, but this is important, so you need to follow this. There are two different legal regimes. There is NSA activities inside our borders and NSA activities outside our borders. Inside our borders, it's covered under FISA, the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act. FISA is a statute passed by Congress, overseen by the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court. FISA is what authorized the phone records program. And even though FISA is a minority of the collection that the NSA does, it got almost all of the news coverage for a year after the Snowden leaks. The authority outside our borders is called Executive Order 12333. 12333 is it's not a law, it's not a statute. It was never passed by Congress. Most members of Congress have no idea how this is being used at all. Even though this is the majority, the NSA is using this authority to collect the majority of intelligence, but it actually got no press at all for a year after the Snowden leaks. A huge amount of data is being collected under 12333. So think about Gmails, Yahoo mails, Hotmails, Apple iMessages, Twitter messages, OkCupid messages, Facebook messages, the audio of phone calls, the geolocation of your cell phone as you move around. It is an enormous amount of data. And then, as I said, the NSA is taking this, it writes its own rules for how to handle all of our data that it collects overseas. Those rules are secret. They could have changed today. None of us would ever know. They do allow the NSA to share this data with the FBI, and it's being used to prosecute Americans. And as I said, they have memorandums of understanding with several allied governments, and they're sending raw transcripts of Americans' communications to the government of Israel, to the government of the UK, Canada, Australia, New Zealand. You might say, well, I'm an American citizen. Why should I have fewer privacy rights just because the NSA collects all my stuff outside our borders as opposed to inside our borders? They would say, well, we're not targeting you. When we collect all your data, it's incidental collection. We actually have a foreign person that we're targeting. But what does that mean in practice? Not very much. They could have just a single legitimate foreign target. So one person overseas who's using all of these services, Gmail, Hotmail, Twitter, OkCupid, whatever it is, right? And they don't just go and take that one person's data. They take all of the data from all of those services for all of the users. So you could, in theory, and it's not that far from this, have just a single foreign target and then collect 3 or 4 billion people's data, and all of the rest of that, those 3 or 4 billion people, would be incidental collection. They call it incidental, but it's not accidental. They know exactly what they're doing. They intentionally design these programs to collect as much as possible. It's a lot. And you might say, how can they even do that? Do they even have the capacity to collect this much data? It's a huge amount of data. And the answer is yes, they do. The NSA has over half a dozen large data centers throughout the United States. The most famous recently is in Bluffdale, Utah. The facility there is 5 times the size of the US Capitol building, filled with computers. It has its own power plant that burns $40 million every year in electricity. And that's just one of the data centers. The data center in Fort Meade, which is the headquarters of the NSA, might be even bigger. It actually, they maxed out the power grid there and basically had to build these other data centers. There's data centers in Colorado, in Texas, in Hawaii, in West Virginia, a few other states. So what the NSA is doing is truly historic. Generations from now, people will look back and say, this time, right now, today, was the first time in millions of years of human history that a single agency was able to collect and store and analyze such a huge part of the world's communications. It's a threshold moment. Behind me is the text of the Fourth Amendment. The right of the people to be secure in their persons, houses, papers, and effects against unreasonable searches and seizures shall not be violated. Why did the founders of our country put this in the Constitution? Because they understood that an unchecked government power to know everything its citizens are doing is very dangerous and easily abused. Maybe you trust our government today not to misuse our data that they've collected this way. Do you trust the foreign governments that they're sharing our data with? They don't represent us. Are you sure you'll trust the government 20 or 30 years from now? Imagine this, a charismatic leader emerges with a widespread support, with a new vision for this country. But the government perceives this person as a threat and seeks to undermine them. They do everything that they can to humiliate them, to show facts from their personal life in public. If you don't think that can happen in this country, you're wrong. It has happened. This is a letter written by the FBI, delivered to Martin Luther King. The American public, the church organizations that have been helping, you will know what you are, an evil, abnormal beast. You are done. King, there is only one thing left for you to do. You know what it is. There is but one way out for you. You better take it before your filthy, abnormal, fraudulent self is bared to the nation. That was J. Edgar Hoover's FBI. And imagine what Hoover could do with the amount of data that the NSA has. A lot of people say, I have nothing to hide. I don't mind if they're collecting everything I do. To that I'd say, really? I mean, let's take the text of every email you've ever sent, all the photos you've ever taken, the naughty ones too, the audio of all of your phone calls, and the geolocation of your cell phone as you move around. Let's give it all to a 22-year-old with a security clearance living underground. That should be a little bit creepy to you. And think about the effects on freedom of speech. The next time you're talking to your accountant with a tax question, or your lawyer about a legal problem, or someone you love in an intimate conversation, will you tweak what you say and not say what you really think because you're worried someone is watching? There's actually a legal term for this. It's called chilling effects. It's a key part of the Supreme Court's First Amendment analysis. The founders of our country added this to the Constitution because they know that privacy and secrets from the government are necessary in a democracy. A lawyer defending their client from charges, maybe politically motivated, needs to be able to keep secrets from the government. A journalist investigating government wrongdoing needs to be able to develop confidential sources. The founders gave us this right, and the NSA today is taking it away. Who decides what these words mean? Is it the American people? Is it the Supreme Court? Or is it a tiny group of spies working in total secrecy with no transparency and no accountability? I told you, most members of Congress have no idea how 12333 is being used. I personally briefed several of them who didn't know anything about it. No court has ever ruled on the legality of this collection. And in fact, if you try to bring a lawsuit challenging it, your lawsuit will be thrown out of court on procedural grounds. You won't even get to argue to the judge that it's illegal. Let's say you wanted to run for office opposing 12333. Americans don't even know enough about it to make an informed opinion. In a different speech, I tried to put in the line, Americans have the opportunity to change our intelligence practices through the democratic process. The White House counsel's office called me and said, you have to cut that or change that line. They don't. But Americans cannot change these practices through the democratic process. So this brings me back to my story. So there I am, it's January 16th. I am working late on this speech. I realize that the speech, just like all the press for the last 7 months since the Snowden leaks, has been focused on only the FISA authorities, the domestic authorities I mentioned earlier. And there's no mention at all of the huge privacy implications for Americans of collection under 12333. I try to make some edits that would broaden the references to commit the US government when the speech is delivered to providing better protections for Americans. But I go to bed that night, wake up the next day, and none of my edits made it in. I'm very disappointed, disillusioned, and I have to decide, what am I going to do now? When I started my job, my first day as a civil servant, like all civil servants, I took an oath to protect and defend the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic. What does that mean? And so, for 7 months, the president had been saying, Snowden didn't have to leak all this stuff. There's legal channels in place. You can file complaints and go to Congress. So I decided to see if that would work. I told my boss I had these concerns. I met with the Inspector General at the State Department. I met with staff from the House and Senate Intelligence Committees. And then a few weeks later, after I had left my job and my security clearance had lapsed, I went to the NSA itself, the Inspector General there. And to give you a sense of it, it's Fort Meade, Maryland. It's a giant building covered in black glass surrounded by this ocean of parking lots. And I walk in with my suit and my lawyer, and on the wall or all these public service posters. But instead, like a school, but instead of saying wash your hands and don't do drugs, it's like, don't tell your family anything. Beware of journalists. I get up into the office suite where I'm going to give my complaint, and the first thing the guy does is flip a light switch, and then this red light on the ceiling, like a police light, starts spinning around. And it's a warning to everyone else in the office to be careful not to say anything that we might overhear. So it was just spinning there for 3 hours. Ultimately, I ended up getting a letter that basically said, we received your complaint. We've taken the action deemed appropriate. Which probably means nothing, right? So where does that leave us? Congress doesn't know enough to change this. The American people don't know enough to make this an election issue. No court has jurisdiction to change this. Complaints inside the executive branch don't work. We are left in a situation where a tiny group of spies working in secret are deciding for all of us what these words mean. This is a quote from the speech that I was editing the night of January 16th. They, the employees of the NSA, are not abusing authorities in order to listen to your private phone calls or read your emails. Now, when you read that, maybe most people who grew up speaking English would think, that means they're not listening to my private phone calls or reading my emails. But that's not what it means. What it means is they are not abusing authorities when they do that. They have the authorities they need to do it. That's what that line means. This doesn't have to be this way. I think that we need a strong NSA. I don't want to abolish the NSA. But it's gone too far. I've personally seen the benefits of intelligence for US national security, for global security, and the NSA does a lot of very important things. But the systems in place right now are not sufficient to protect the rights of Americans. I've started a petition that is calling on the NSA and President Obama immediately to delete Americans' data when it's incidentally collected under 12333. And it's also calling on both the House and Senate to hold public hearings about how this executive order is being used to influence our rights. 65 years ago, George Orwell wrote a book called 1984. One of the main characters in the book is called Big Brother. But Big Brother is not a person. Big Brother is the surveillance state. And Big Brother has put a camera and a microphone in every room of every house. And you'd say, are we really there yet? Well, today we just carry those things voluntarily in our pockets. And so when you leave here and the first thing you do is take out your phone to look, you can think to yourself, at least in 1984, they knew that Big Brother was watching. Thank you.